Okay, thank you for joining our session on the child protection in the context of climate crisis, addressing intersectionality in humanitarian section. People are coming in the room, and those who are at the venue, thank you for joining our session and being there. We are going to we are starting shortly, but just to flag that this session would be delivered remotely while having some audience in the room. So it's a bit different style of hybrid session, but we are happy to have you all here today. Before we start the session itself, Pedro, if you can move to the housekeeping slide. Thank you. For those joining online, translated captions are available. So please feel free to click the icon at the bottom bar, the show captions, and use a translated caption function on Zoom. So please click on the captions icon at the bottom and select the language in which you prefer your captions to be. Okay, and there will be a Q&A time at the end of the session. And for online participants, please use the Q&A function, the Q&A box to ask questions. And it would be great if you can name who you are asking or who you want to answer your question. The in-person participants would have, again, during the Q&A time, please raise your hand by clicking the button on at your seat and ask your questions. We'd have someone to pick up your questions in the room. Also, for in-person participants, please grab your phone because we will use some Menti quiz during the session. I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. My name is Manami Kawamoto, and I'm program specialist in the Alliance for the Secretariat of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. I also chair a group of friends on climate crisis and child protection within the Alliance to spearhead our activities and the strategy towards this area. So, I see people coming in, but I would like to ask a very quick one question before we kick off our presentation part. Please go to scan the QR code, Ment QR code, or type in ment.com in your browser and type these 8-digit 49364320, or click the link in the chat. We put the link in the chat. So please go to menti.com, put Menti link and put the code or click the link in the chat. So the question is, what is the first word that comes to you when thinking of the impact of the climate crisis to children? What is the first word that comes to mind to you when thinking of the impact of the climate crisis to children? Let's see what kind of words are trickling in. Let's see, Pedro, if you can. Yeah, thank you. Oh, here goes. Climate anxiety, increased conflict, exacerbates risk, disruption of education, yes, psychosocial distress, change, justice, trauma, water, movement, yes, mental health, child rights crisis, bottom, protection, responsibility, desertification, fear, uncertainty. It's great to see this variety of words coming in from different from humanitarian actors from different fields. I'm so glad that some words are linked to child protection area, as well as other risks or issues affecting children. Please keep typing, and good to have a sense of whom we have in this room or in this session. So, without further ado, if you can go back to the slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So now, thank you for volunteering, putting the words in the Menti and the word cloud. Now, I'd like to invite Camilla Jones, Deputy Director of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action, who will kick us off the session and also provide some introductory notes to set the scene. So over to you, Camilla. Floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Manami, for getting us started and for inviting me to provide the opening remarks today. And good morning to all of those joining us online and in the room. I think it will be morning for most of us, seeing as we're starting quite early today. And welcome again to our session on the intersectionality between climate crises and child protection. So we looked at the intersection between children and the climate crisis in the Menti just now, but we wanted to say a little bit about what we mean by child protection in case there's some joining us from beyond the child protection sector, which is expected, seeing as HNPW draws on participants from across humanitarian disciplines, although I have a suspicion from the Menti results that quite a lot of you have a child protection kind of experience, background, etc. So when we're talking about child protection, we're talking about prevention of and response to abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence affecting children. And in case that doesn't help you, still, we're essentially talking about prevention and response to harm to children. Which includes risks to their environment and lack of protective factors, such as losing their parents or impacts on their household economy that drive children into risky situations. And we'll, of course, get into this in a lot more depth during today's session, as it's our main area of focus. In this session, we've got a fantastic set of speakers and facilitators, and they're going to walk us through how the climate crisis is impacting on child protection in different parts of the world. And it's an interactive session, so they're going to enable us to explore this together, looking at good practices and challenges that we are seeing when we're responding to protection needs. But before handing over to them, we wanted to cover a few bases, introducing the session and getting you thinking about some of the issues at hand. So first, I should really say a little bit more about the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action, in case you're not aware. So we are a global network. The Alliance has over 300 member organizations from across operational agencies, academic institutions, and we have a few of those with us today, policymakers, donors, and practitioners, including over half of our members being from local and national NGOs, including one of our members from South Sudan here today. We facilitate interagency technical collaboration on child protection across all humanitarian contexts, and the climate crisis is a part of our current strategy. So, what about the climate crisis? Well, we know that it's already having a devastating impact on the safety and well-being of children across the globe. 2024 was the hottest year on record, and the climate crisis has become the biggest driver of the increase in humanitarian crises. We're seeing extreme weather events now 8 times more frequent than 20 years ago. And we're seeing this in a range of contexts, including in many of our own backyards. We're looking at heat waves, cyclones, flooding, and also lack of water. In the last 2 decades, we're seeing an increased frequency and intensity of crises, with extreme wildfires more than doubling. And in 2023, forcibly displaced people globally reached a record high, with climate-induced disasters a driver of this. And with children, there's significant impacts as well. So according to the Children's Climate Risk Index, 1 billion children are already at extremely high risk from the impacts of the climate crisis. Almost all of the contexts where these 1 billion children live are considered fragile contexts, which includes humanitarian contexts. So really, this is the risk factor for children in humanitarian contexts. And the impacts that the climate crisis is having on children's lives and protection is severe, as we're going to discuss today. So what has the Alliance been doing about this? Well, recognizing that the climate crisis is a threat multiplier for children and adolescents, in 2024, our Learning and Development Working Group conducted a learning needs analysis on the intersectionality of the climate crisis and child protection. And we'll get into those learning needs that we've identified later in the session. But some of the key findings of this analysis were that the climate crisis increases risk factors for children and their families, as I've already mentioned. It also affects access to essential services due to the damage to infrastructure and the disruption to services. And such factors put millions of children at risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse. The learning needs analysis conducted key informant interviews and focus group discussions, and the analysis found that climate crisis impacts children's protection in several ways. Most commonly, increased prevalence of negative coping mechanisms, including child labour, child marriage, and child recruitment into armed forces and armed groups. It also increases the risk of trafficking and sexual violence, and it heightens psychosocial distress among children and caregivers. So in total, the climate crisis exacerbates threats to children's safety, mental health, and psychosocial well-being, as well as exacerbating inequity through the intergenerational impacts that then follow. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs. And worse still, we know that children and young people contribute the least to climate change, yet they suffer the most. But there is a positive. We as humanitarian actors can play a critical role in developing and supporting approaches to prevent child protection risks and strengthening protective factors to help children, families, and communities to better prepare for and mitigate the negative impacts of the climate crisis together. So let's see where we get to today and beyond today. I'll hand back to Manami now to take us through how we can get moving on some of this together. So back to you, Manami, and thank you.
Thank you, Camila, and thank you for giving a wonderful opening remarks and setting the scene for us. Now, I am excited to have another wonderful speakers here today. First, I'd like to note that there's growing evidence of the impact of climate crisis on child rights these days, but we still lack hard evidence and systematic reviews of increased child protection risks that connected to the climate crisis. And today I'm excited to have Professor Lucy Glover, Professor of Child and Family Social Work from University of Oxford and University of Cape Town, together with Mona Ibrahim, Policy Engagement Advisor from University of Oxford. Professor Lucy and Mona will present the research findings on the violence against children in climate-induced disasters. So over to you, both of you. Welcome. Oh, sorry. Before that. And then after Lucy and Mona, I would like to invite Rin Gawech-Kwol, National Director of Child Destiny and Development Organization based in South Sudan. Rin will share his experience in adopting child protection programs with other sectors during the devastating floods in South Sudan. And finally, we'll have Elena Giannini, co-lead of the Alliance Learning and Development Working Group, who would unpack the learning needs analysis among learning needs among child protection practitioners to better prevent and respond to child protection issues in the climate crisis. So finally, I'd like to hand over the floor to Lucy and Mona. Over to you and welcome.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Manami, for this introduction and for arranging such an important session at this time. I'm Mona, and I'm joined here by Professor Lucy, and we'll talk today about some of the child protection evidence that we're finding coming out across climate emergencies in sub-Saharan Africa. So we know that children have been the worst affected by climate emergencies. And it's very clear that climate disasters don't just damage the infrastructure, they break the protective systems that keep children safe. And just looking at the statistics here, from UNICEF, from Save the Children, showing that 1 billion children are at extreme risk of climate change, and just under 1 billion experience both poverty and climate risk. We can see that this is not a future issue anymore. It's not just a distant threat, it's happening now. It's affecting children's lives, their future, and their safety. And so we started to try to understand what this risk entails. And this is just a bit about our team. We are a multidisciplinary team based across University of Oxford and University of Cape Town. And within our team, we have demographists, we have social scientists, we have doctors, and epidemiologists. So we really do try to bring our minds together to try to find not only what are the risks that children face, but what are the possible solutions. And we were really kind of lucky to have so many brilliant thinking partners across the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, across UNICEF, Save the Children, World Vision, and IFRC. So this work is only possible with this kind of collaboration that cuts across sectors. In order to think about child protection and climate emergencies, which are two somewhat separate sectors that intersect really dangerous in emergencies, we had to think very creatively about how we can start to see this. So this example here is some of the methods we've been exploring. And normally how research and traditional methods go, it normally is difficult to start seeing kind of trends and patterns across multiple data sources. So what we tried to start doing is looking at child protection and mapping that out, and then comparing it with levels of violence, of epidemics, of health issues affecting children, and then mapping that with satellite data on extreme weather events. And this starts to give us a picture of who is at risk, where are they, and what are the hotspots of violence, and how do they interact with climate. I'll now pass on to Lucy for some of the initial findings.
And thanks, and I what we're going to show you here is just some of the early evidence that we are finding, and I think a particular mention to this. This research was driven and inspired by conversations that we had, particularly with Manami, with Eleanor, and with Honey and Elspeth and colleagues across the Alliance, and with colleagues at the World Food Programme, like Michael Smith, and really raising these challenges that made us say, can we look and see if this is being seen at a wide scale? Now, what you're looking at here is evidence on emotional violence. It's very similar for physical violence. And this is across 28,000 girls and boys in the Violent Children surveys across 5 countries in Southern and Eastern Africa, overlaid with drought data, and for the drought data, we've used satellite data for that. And what we can see here, and a repeating pattern, is that we're seeing doubled rates. This is a multivariate model controlling for a whole set of cofactors and led by early career researcher Dr. Bethena El-Tigani. And we're seeing doubled rates of emotional and physical violence against children in severe drought. We're not seeing the same impacts in kind of more moderate levels of rainfall challenges. If we go to the next slide, actually, I can do that. We see again these challenges that were raised in the Alliance's learning needs analysis. We're seeing them playing through in the large scale data. So this is looking at the challenges which Camilla just mentioned of transactional sex and sexual exploitation. And we're seeing, and this is amongst 22,000 girls, we don't see increased risk for boys, but for girls, we're seeing, again, a more than doubled risk of transactional sexual exploitation, again, only in context of severe drought. If we look then at another great challenge, and this is a linked challenge, but one that we've just started to look at, of extreme heat and heat waves. And this has been a real new concern. We've been talking with colleagues like Govinda at IFRC who are really thinking about this. Again, we're starting to see these really severe risks. And in this model, we've actually separated it out so you can see the difference between no heat wave, a kind of mild or moderate heat wave, and a severe heat wave. And we're looking here at sexual violence. This is rape or sexual assault of girls. And we've just looked here at ages 13 to 19 across 5 countries. And what we see, and if I spell these out, we see that in a situation of no heat wave, in the past year, just around sort of 3.5% of girls have experienced sexual violence. If we look in a moderate heat wave context, that's going up to around 7%. But if we look in a severe heatwave context, that rate has risen to just under 15, around 14%. We're seeing massively increased risks of sexual violence in severe heat waves. And this is really early analyses that we're showing you. We don't yet know lots of really important things about this. We don't know what's causing it. We don't know who's most at risk. And we're going to talk a bit now about what are these things that we need to understand, and most importantly, how can we start getting to solutions? Back to you, Mona.
So we started looking at historical facts. Which groups of children are systematically neglected when it comes to violence prevention? Which children were most affected during the HIV epidemic? Which children were most affected during Ebola, and spikes of violence? And some of the literature coming out started to consistently speak to some of these groups, including displaced people, refugees, children living with disabilities, girls married as children, and even people who've been working across the humanitarian and development sectors can completely understand how difficult it is to not only find these children, but include them in programming. So this is the next big challenge for us, is to understand how to create interventions that can reach not only children who are at risk of violence, but children who have been experiencing it systematically, and who are at heightened risk in climate shocks. Some of the previous literature around this as well shows us that it is possible to find interventions that can address both the high levels of violence affecting children and improve their future prospects. So we don't have to choose one or another. It's not just either a response or building a future. There are interventions that can do both. And a big part of the research we'll be doing over the coming months is understanding what that means, which solutions can improve both child protection and climate resilience simultaneously. And some of the evidence coming out, thanks to the Alliance for Child Protection, really shows that there is a need here. Actors who are at the front lines in climate emergencies can see that there have been gaps in supporting children. Our colleagues at WFP have been saying there needs to be some sort of age and gender incorporation into anticipatory action, into disaster risk management. So we're trying to bring together both people's experiences and some of the existing literature that we already know. And what we're finding is that different climate hazards work very broadly across similar risk pathways. Hypothesized risk mechanisms include things like caregiver death. A child that's lost a parent due to a climate emergency has an entire disrupted future. Similarly, we see the same with poverty, displacement, school closures. But what we can start to see is that there are also possible prevention strategies. And if you have, if immediately some interventions popped into your mind, do pop them in the chat. Do share with us during the panel questions later, because we're trying to start to map out what can possibly interrupt these pathways and prevent all these different types of abuse. Back to you, Lucy.
Oh, we were both. But I think something we've got Susanna's photo here because of some of the really important work that's been done, and Camilla, I think of you also with this. We're thinking about what are the minimum standards for child protection. And then we try and think about those in relation to the context that we are in the world right now. We are absolutely clear that we are looking at population explosion, particularly in the countries and the regions we see here, Asia and Africa, which are being most affected by climate change. We're also painfully aware, all of us, that funding is going rapidly down and that we're not in a situation right now where we can introduce a new problem and demand a massive amount of new funding for new programs, new systems to address that problem. And so we're going to have to think both about what is going to work, but also what is going to be strategically feasible over these next few years of, I think, real complexity and hardship. And so the learning needs analysis has been incredibly helpful in this because it's identified even now what are some of the major challenges. This is what practitioners identified, the major challenges in addressing child protection in climate and humanitarian responses. And we see that the three major challenges are lack of knowledge. And of course, that's partly based on the fact that this is such a new challenge. We've got to advocate and help people to understand what's going on. But we also see the lack of funding and the lack of staff. And so really, as we start to plan together and think about what are going to be the solutions and mitigation factors that can be effective, we are going to have to think of them in that context. And in many ways, I hate saying that because, you know, of course, if the world was a just one, we would be saying that we need to have a massive new influx of support for this. But I think we are also going to have to be very pragmatic. And so we've been trying to think conceptually, and this has been hugely important discussions in the group of friends that Manami is chairing, where a whole group of colleagues are just trying to think together about what our responses can be. And some of the thinking, and would welcome more from colleagues who are joining, are can we find programs that are effective on both climate mitigation and protection outcomes? And we'll talk a bit more about possibilities for those. Can we think about climate responses and influencing the climate world to become more age sensitive, to think about impacts on children? But equally, can we be encouraging the worlds of health delivery, of humanitarian delivery, of child protection delivery outside the humanitarian context, to be integrating anticipatory action, early warning systems that mean that in combination we are protecting children better? And thirdly, can we start understanding and improving our evidence of low-cost delivery approaches? And this is by, you know, people always talk about digital. It's by we're learning. It's by no means it's not by no means a solution, and it's often even harder in humanitarian contexts. But we do need to start trying to think and understand what are ways of bringing things together that can reduce costs. And there is some valuable new evidence. And just as an example, if we look at the prevention of sexual violence, where even a couple of years ago, there was almost no randomized control trial evidence of effective programs. We're now moving into a context where there's increasing evidence. A recent WHO review, for example, of parenting programs found 18 randomized control trials in humanitarian contexts. We're increasing that evidence, and we're also increasing the practice knowledge and understanding. But we are also going to have to start thinking about some of these climate solutions, and this is thinking that Hani has been really forward-thinking in, and saying, for example, does a program like school food gardens or different types of agricultural anticipatory action, do these have the potential to disrupt some of the pathways that we saw that Camilla talked about, these pathways to increase child protection risks for children and adolescents? And so I think we're in the early days of the science of understanding this. And I think that when I read the learning needs analysis, I really thought that practice is further than science in this context right now. But if we're thinking about next steps, we're going to have to think about early warning systems and response, building resilience and climate sensitive systems, and crucially, cost-effective interventions. We look forward to the rest of this discussion and to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Mona. And it was a really strong evidence speaking to the audience, but to us who are exploring the impact, and the impact of climate crisis on children, but also the way forward, what we need to do, how we can adapt our programming to respond to the needs. So now I'm excited to have Rin will talk about his on-the-ground experience in preventing and responding to the devastating floods that South Sudan has been facing in the recent years. So over to you, Rin.
Thank you very much, Manami, for the introduction. And I want to appreciate your efforts and the efforts of the Alliance and other members and also panelists. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Ringa Wishkol. I'm the National Director for Child Destiny and Development Organization and National NGO. I want to share with you briefly, almost we have 7 slides, but very fast I will go through them. on what we have been experiencing here in South Sudan, especially when the climate change, affected every sector in South Sudan here, especially the children. As you can see from the two pictures, those are the impact actually, because the climate change was felt seriously in South Sudan, especially in the northern states. That's Greater Upper Nile, Unity, Jonglei, and also Upper Nile State. Next slide. Let me give you a brief background about Child Destiny. Child Destiny and Development Organization is a non-partisan and non-profitable and non-governmental organization that is child right based. It was founded on 25th November 2001. Our aim is to provide quality humanitarian and developmental services to vulnerable children, and we envision a transformed and flourished life of every vulnerable and needy child to contribute positively in the society, that is South Sudan. And then our mission is to commitment to dignity and development and welfare of all children by providing a protective, healthy, and friendly environment for holistic development to realize their latent potentials. SHIDO actually has been providing education in emergency, child protection emergency since 2016, in the country. Next. The context of South Sudan actually is, in terms of climate change, is terrible. Basing on the information that we got, from different sources, South Sudan actually remain the most susceptible, vulnerable, to climate change among the 9 countries, and is number 10 actually that were quoted to climate change crisis, especially drought, heat waves, and flooding. And also Greater Upper Nile actually region was severely affected, and Unity State together by the climate change shocks, especially the seasonal flooding in the last consecutive 7 years, leading to devastating destruction of the already limited social services, livestock, livelihood, agriculture, road networks, wash, education facilities, increasing the number of out-of-school children and child protection risks in many parts in the country. As you can see from those pictures, many schools were devastated, were destroyed completely, houses were submerged, and even also cattle died because, there were no grasses for them to feed on. And you can see number of classrooms were actually, blown off by strong wind. And the situation actually was very, very devastating. Next. Okay. Wait, sorry. Maneme, you can go ahead. Okay. Yeah, sorry, go back a bit. Again. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, next. We have the crisis impact on children. What happened, among the children when this crisis, climate crisis, happened in the country? Number one, there was increase of child labor due to poverty level because, floods has destroyed livelihood of every community, and people actually were coping using different ways, and children became the victims of child labor. Also, we saw displacement and heightened risk of family separation. And then also you see child abuse, exploitation, violence, stress, and trauma. And as I said earlier, destruction of and closure of schools and disruption of learning continuity due to displacement. I can testify that last month, when the government of South Sudan saw that, the heat waves were very high and many children, collapsed in schools, so they have to close down the schools till they were open later last week on 17th of this month. So that's the impact that we saw also here. And then you see the destruction of schools also. I earlier showed those pictures where, the roofing of classrooms and some schools were submerged completely by flooding. And then also we saw other dangers and injuries such as snake bites and drowning. And snake bites actually was a big challenge because, when you cross the river, you get a lot of snakes, and then they bitten people and also children. And the worst part was that, many families also were not actually serious, to protect their children, especially playing, in open ponds or in the river, and then those children also, some of them actually drowned. That was actually the impact of the flooding. Next. And then we have some challenges, that we faced as a humanitarian or children focused organizations in the country. One of them is the access to areas that were in need for child protection response. So the lack of awareness and indifference among parents, guardians, and community members in protecting children, increasing the risk of drowning during floods. And that's what I said, actually. Some children actually drown because their parents, they don't even also pay attention, to take care of their children. And then also we have inadequate health facilities. For example, when there was a snake bite, so it is very hard to get, a nearby health center because all the health facilities actually were destroyed by flooding. So, and also we have a lot of antivenom drugs shortage to treat those who were bitten by snakes. And then also there's lack of available referral pathways to the specialized service providers. For example, in cases of snake bites, for example, as I said, and then also we have other, referral pathways. So that was also a challenge. And then also we faced funding constraints for child protection activities due to climate change crisis. Next. And then what are the mitigating measures that we use, especially in those sectors where we were responding? In livelihood, actually, we produced, because, all the livelihood opportunities of people or community members were actually washed away. So there was a need actually for looking for other means so that they can survive. So what we did was that we produced, canoes, local canoes, and then we distributed those canoes to the most vulnerable families so that, they get livelihood where they transport people and also, transporting goods from somewhere. So that's when also they actually got their livelihood, daily livelihood, actually, because everything was washed away, whether cattle, whether sheep, whether cows or farm, everything. There was no other means for livelihood. And then, okay, next. And then also in education, we actually constructed temporary learning spaces, semi-concrete temporary learning spaces for those children that were displaced by flooding. And then also we created awareness using, comprehensive safe school framework on disaster risk reduction. And this, framework actually was produced by global framework. Is it Global Alliance for Risk Reduction in Education, especially and resilience in education. So that was actually the the tool that we use, to create awareness in schools, especially engaging the parents, the teachers, and also the school managers. And then, okay, I said earlier that we constructed temporary learning spaces, and some of them also actually were, you can see the pictures, some of them were concrete a bit, we renovated some of them, so that those children also can learn in a safe classroom. And then also we conducted awareness workshops, especially for the education actors, using this comprehensive safe school framework. Actually, is a very good one. It has 3 pillars and also foundation, very good one. So that's what we use actually to advocate for incorporation of climate change in curriculum, which is not actually here, not here in South Sudan education curriculum. So that was actually our main focus for advocacy. Next. That's all? Okay. And then we have the call to action. And this is what we recommended. And we also hope that we will also keep engaging, to forge strategic partnerships with like-minded child protection, education, and climate change partners to address climate-induced risks on children. And then also we advocate for climate change inclusion into school curriculums, and that's what actually we are trying also to engage the education stakeholders, so that we have this greening schools using a holistic institutional approach that was introduced or developed by UNESCO at national, state, and local levels. And then also we are trying, to explore funding and long-term investment in child protection, education, and climate change shocks in humanitarian settings. That's our actually plan. And also that's our call. And also we need also to enhance the capacity of local communities, education stakeholders, and also child protection structures using comprehensive safe school framework. I think I can stop from here. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Manami.
Thank you so much, Irene, and bringing your on-the-ground experience as well as the really concrete call to action. So now I'd like to hand over the floor to Elena, who will walk us through the learning needs analysis findings. So over to you, Elena.
Thanks, Manami, and thank you very much, Ring, Lucy, Mona, Camilla, for all of the contributions that you've shared so far. I think a lot of what has been said, will corroborate some of the findings of the learning needs analysis. So let us start by talking why we actually engaged with the implementation of a learning needs analysis on the intersectionality of child protection and climate-induced crisis. So we sought basically to understand how climate change induced crisis impacted on the protection of children in humanitarian setting, but also how child protection organizations were already responding to these impacts, and what knowledge and skills are required for both child protection practitioners but other humanitarian practitioners as well, and climate colleagues, to better implement strategies that can enhance the safety, well-being, and protection of children in the context of humanitarian setting. We used a mixed methodology, like Camilla briefly introduced earlier. I will not dwell too long on the methodology itself, but it was first of all a desk review. These are not in order, but it's fine. which focused on climate-driven crisis in humanitarian settings, selecting documents which had a focus specifically on children and for the period between 2020 and 2024. So we didn't take in consideration earlier documents. We added the online survey, obviously delivered like in several languages, over 100 responses. We had like a few focus group discussions, and we also had some discussions at our last year annual meeting, the Alliance annual meeting in Panama, which took place face-to-face last year. There were also some stakeholders which contributed some content like via email because they could not participate in focus group discussions, and I think it's worth recognizing the inputs from practitioners and their efforts in participating in this type of exercises. So in terms of the impacts on children, as most has already been said, like by Camilla, by Lucy, by Mona in the introductions and the presentation of their research from the University of Oxford and Cape Town. But building on their insight, the learning needs analysis identified several key child protection concerns in the context of climate-induced crisis. First, increase the prevalence of negative coping mechanisms such as child marriage, child labor, trafficking, child recruitment, mainly as a result of livelihood, as Ring was sharing earlier. Violence and abuse tend to be also on the rise due to increased pressures on parents and caregivers. Lack of access to services. This can be due to displacement, so because populations are forced to move, or because there are environmental disruptions that cause this impossibility to access services. Family separation, which is another big one for child protection, again, as a result of displacement or loss of livelihood. And then psychosocial distress, increasing fear, experience of emergencies, and the climate anxiety, which tends to be a big child protection concern that like we will need to tackle, especially with youth and adolescents moving forward. Finally, dangers and injuries as a result of the immediate physical impact of the crisis on a physical environment itself. So as Lucy was saying earlier, practitioners like are a bit earlier than scientists in some realms, and like by no means this learning needs analysis presents all of like the adaptations that are out there, but we did capture a few that we thought like would be interesting like to feature. And the first one being developing child protection strategies, guidance, and plans that consider the climate crisis. For example, a set of guiding principles for children on the move in the context of climate change has been developed by UNICEF, IOM, and the Georgetown University and the UN University, aiming to ensure that risks threatening the safety, security, and well-being of children on the move are minimized. Then adjusting the physical environment in which child protection activities take place and practical provisions for this. So for example, moving activities indoor for extreme weather, or providing cooling or heating system inside child protection centers or schools, like in education in emergencies, for example. Adjusting also the hours in which some of the activities take place. This is particularly true for heat waves, for example. One example that we collated like around this was from an experience from UNICEF in Mongolia, where the national government, together with UNICEF, retrofitted the kindergartens to ensure better ventilation, air filtration, insulation, and heating. So that's one of the measures that was put in place. Another important activity which is already taking place, and we are featuring one example, but I'm sure there are many out there, responding and awareness raises on climate change-induced child protection risks. So, for example, in Cambodia, This Life, which is an organization, is using social media messaging applications to individually contact and educate children and families on the causes and consequences of climate change, including child protection risks. And then there are some activities like around evidence generation and advocacy on the impact of climate change-induced crises on children and adolescents. So, for example, conducting research or longitudinal studies to understand how child protection in humanitarian action activities can better respond to child protection needs in the aftermath of climate-related events and influence the resilience of children and communities. The Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility and the International Federation of the Red Cross worked in partnership to generate an analysis report on the protection of children in climate-related disasters in Southeast Asia specifically. And the report sought to understand children's perspective on climate change and resultant risks that they face. Now, these are very, these are just very summarized examples, so you can find a bit more information in the learning needs analysis and research in these examples specifically. But the last example of adaptations we wanted to briefly present was the possibility to develop a new partnership and coalitions, for example, working with ministries of environment. One example that we collated was, it's from 2007 in this case, and it's from Child Fund Alliance, Plan International, Save the Children, UNICEF, and World Vision International that formed the Children in Changing Climate Coalition to advocate and promote children's rights in the context of climate crisis. So as I said, the list is not exhaustive and it's just a representation of what is out there, and more examples are to be gathered as we will learn as we go through the recommendation of the learning needs analysis itself. But before I go further, if Pedro can assist me, I have like a quick Mentimeter, and I wanted to propose a quick question to you all. My question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how prepared do you think humanitarian practitioners are to address the impact of the climate crisis? And once Pedro is ready, we can get this up. Thank you very much, Pedro. So you can join the Menti by typing menti.com and the code 49364320 on your browser, or you can scan the QR code that you see on screen. I'll repeat the question while you're getting set up. On a scale of 1 to 10, how prepared do you think humanitarian practitioners are to address the impacts of climate crisis? 1 being not prepared at all and 10 being fully prepared. I forgot to mention that. Okay. So for now, we are at 3.7, 3.8. It's growing. Well, slowly moving like to a middle ground where we are a little bit prepared, but not very prepared. The Menti link, someone's asking in the chat, like we can, maybe Manami, thanks a lot, Manami, you're a star, thanks. And sorry, we didn't share that before, so I'll give just a second more like to, for participants online to be able to vote. Well, yes, I think that's, I mean, answers that are trickling in are staying around those parameters of 3.8. So we are technically prepared, but maybe not prepared like for this type of context, or need a little bit more time to be able to adapt to these crises that are happening fast and in new locations. If we can go back to the presentation, Pedro, and we can. So when we are back, I will start so that you have the full visual. Great. There we are. Great. So the prioritization of learning needs was largely consistent between participants who joined online and those that participated in the Alliance annual meeting. And in the graph in blue, we represent online participants, while in orange indicate those who participated in the annual meeting. Don't be too fast about that. But red highlights the priorities that, in my view, are cross-sectoral learning needs, as they hold relevance for all humanitarian practitioners. As the graph might be a bit hard to read, I will read through the identified learning priorities in order. Awareness of climate crisis fundamentals, understanding the impact of climate change induced crisis on children, analyzing child protection risks and vulnerabilities in the context of climate change, identifying prevention and mitigation measures, adapting child protection strategies to respond to climate risks, collaboration and working across sectors for child protection in the context of climate change, and evidence and advocacy for child protection in this specific context of climate change. The priorities which I thought were relevant to other sectors mentioned before are understanding the impact of climate change-induced crisis on children, as I think this is relevant for all types of programming. Feel free to contradict me. Feel free to share questions and opinions in the chat. Analyzing child protection risks and vulnerabilities in the context of climate change-induced crisis. So being able to first understand, and then analyze in our own context what are the impacts of climate change crisis, on children. Identifying prevention and mitigation measures. Now, obviously, we will look more at the angle within child protection, working on child protection specifically, but within other sectors, this may be important, within your relevant strategies. And then adapting child protection strategies to respond to climate risks. And in the case of other sectors, this is obviously relevant for your own strategy. So how do you respond to climate risks while protecting children? So this might be of interest to you all. The vast majority of the learning resources identified are online and self-paced resources. It is most common for resources to be designed for a broader humanitarian audience. Far fewer are designed for specific audiences such as disaster risk reduction, climate change specialists, civil servants, national representatives, youth activists. While all identified resources are related to climate change and developed by humanitarian organizations, they cover a range of themes and topics within this broader umbrella. So, for example, there are the most prevalent amongst these themes are program design and planning. So some modules are related to one of the steps of program design. So, for example, on assessment, on identifying adaptations, prioritization, etc. Disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Climate change introductory modules, and reducing environmental impacts. So modules providing information on how to reduce individuals and organizational impact on environment. Surveys and focus group participants face challenging in identifying learning resources. So most of the respondents were not aware of these resources. So we have to do a better job at disseminating and socializing like these learning opportunities. This mapping could be useful to others, and it's available online, and we plan to keep it updated. But for now, I'm gonna share the link in the chat, so you will be able to download it directly. And we move like to the section on recommendations that we have drawn like from the learning needs analysis, and I'm focusing specifically on the elements that around learning and development. Most of these recommendations are applicable to other humanitarian sector, and across all of them, it is important, I believe, to recognize that children play a key role, children and adolescents play a key role in tackling the climate crisis, and their meaningful, ethical, safe participation should be mainstreamed throughout wherever it can be conducted meaningfully and ethically, as I mentioned. So the first set of recommendations are around strengthening a shared understanding and access to resources. And one first step is agreeing and disseminating a glossary of key terms and definition. There are documents like that, guidelines tools that you can find online with already available glossary. The main issue here is agreeing on them, like, and how to use them within your own sector. Integrating relevant pre-existing learning materials into Alliance L&D tools, it says here, but obviously for other sector would mean using what is already available out there in terms of learning products for strengthening the capacity of your teams. And the resource mapping I've just shared can be like a great resource to start with. Collating and sharing examples of adaptations, and we mentioned here of child protection programming, but obviously this like can be done for any other sector. And establishing a centralized and easy accessible repository of resources for your sector, so that practitioners know where to go and find what is important for them to respond in the context of climate crisis. Sorry, I'm just trying to, yeah. The next set of recommendation is around strengthening programming and cross-sectoral collaboration. Now, there is one of the recommendation in the learning needs analysis is the development of guidance and tools, some specific guidance and tools, apologies, specifically on risk analysis in climate-induced crisis, prevention and mitigation measures, adaptive strategies for response, cross-sector collaboration in cross-sectoral collaboration in the context of climate crisis, evidence generation, and advocacy. The two elements that I think are critical also for other sectors are around the risk analysis. So without a structured way to analyze and anticipate risks for children, intervention can miss key vulnerabilities and leave them unprotected. So we think this is something that we could be working on. And then cross-sectoral collaboration. Child protection cannot operate obviously in isolation. It must be embedded into other humanitarian sectors and responses. And a clear strategy for cross-sectoral collaboration in the context of climate-induced crisis would ensure child protection is seen and shared, is seen as a shared responsibility across all humanitarian interventions. Finally, the last set of recommendation is around influencing policy and advocacy. Basically exploring opportunity to increase the use of child focus and or child protection lens in climate policy and programming. And yeah, I think that's all from the learning needs analysis. Happy to have been here with you all today, and I'm leaving the floor back to Manami.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you for I'm glad that you emphasized the importance of working across sectors so that it's not only child protection actors who spoke today, but also with you in the room and online from different sectors to work together to support children and to respond and mitigate the risks affecting them. So with the excellent time management skills of all the speakers, we have about 15 minutes to do a Q&A session. I see many questions are coming in to the Q&A box, and so I would like to pick up 2 or 3 questions online first, and then give the floor to the audience in the room, and then come back to the Q&A, the questions in the Q&A box. Yeah. I see, Lucy, you have already answered one question in the Q&A, but I think it would be of interest of other participants to hear more about you. So the question was, there wasn't much on how the implementation of anticipatory actions might help to mitigate child protection risks in particular, linking to the data you presented on droughts. And the AA, the drought settings typically have longer windows of AA opportunity. So what role might AA play? What do you think the AA might play a role in mitigating child protection risks? So over to you, Lucy.
And this, thank you so much. This is a great question, and Manami, Elena, this is one we've been trying to think about together over the last year. I think there are some very obvious things. If we think back to these kind of pathways of risk, there are some obvious ways in which there's real potential here, particularly when we're thinking about sort of agricultural interventions that might interrupt these kind of extreme poverty as a result of something like a drought leading to sexual exploitation, for example. I think we just understand less about some of these AA interventions that are perhaps designed with other outcomes in mind. So if we think about social protection may also be an obvious one, but other ones I think we understand less about, like, for example, infrastructure strengthening. Do we understand how that might influence child protection? What about AA interventions that are maybe designed with quite different outcomes in mind? I also think there's the AA interventions which are being increasingly thinking about education and employment as outcomes, and us understanding those and how they might relate to specifically child abuse and violence against children needs. And I do think that one of the challenges here is that we have these quite different sectors at the moment. Thinking, when we've been speaking to climate scientists, they're just thinking quite differently to us. And so I think one thing that would be of huge value would be for us to think more together and understand more about what are the new things coming up in anticipatory action, and more generally, not related to children. And then for us to try and think, how might these be helping? And also to try and think, are there opportunities to add things in? For example, as an example, we know that parenting programs are a highly effective child protection intervention. We also know that AA is increasingly using cell phone-based delivery for something like social protection in early warning systems. Can we think about layering in effective parenting programs through that same delivery mechanism at a very low cost? We don't yet know, and we would love to talk to you at SAVE, but also broader colleagues for thinking on this. And I guess just to add, I saw a note from Joanne saying, why are we only considering climate change now? And I think there has been thinking, there's been reports like SAVE's report, like IFRC's report, like the Alliance's report. But I have to say, from my point of view, I think we've been, from the point of view of the science of child protection, I think we've been trying so hard to try and get the strong evidence base for child protection interventions that we're only now starting to think, what about these more extreme circumstances? I think it's on us, and now's our job to swiftly bring those together.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Now I'd like to give the floor to Rin. I have two questions to you. It pop it up here. So the first question is, how can governments be taken to task, or how can governments fulfill their constitutionally designated obligations in responding to child protection risks and issues in the climate-induced disaster? The second question is, how can we address the communication challenges in terms of child protection awareness that is sometimes posed by the ever-evolving inclusive language, anti-derogatory wording? So from your experience, Rin, would be great how you work with the government, how you work or you even advocate to the government to fulfill their responsibility, and also how do you address the communication challenges in your context? Over to you, Rin.
Thank you very much, Manani, for the question. Regarding question number one, actually, we work always with the Ministry of Gender, Child and Social Welfare as the line ministry in the government. And what we use and what they always also take as a big responsibility is to, implement, the Child Rights Act in South Sudan to protect children. And also, there is action plan that's being developed also by the ministry together with other child protection partners, especially like UNICEF, Save the Children, and also other local actors. That action plan actually is the one that will guides us actually always when we do any child protection intervention. And the government is number one, because we are just supporting the government, but it's the one that leads that process. That's one. And then when it comes to question number two, we have different communication barriers, especially when it comes to creating awareness in the community. For example, the materials that we use, we use English, for example, or maybe somehow Arabic, but the local languages, actually, few of them are producing, communication materials, to create awareness in the community. And what we always, avoid is, to rush and do something that is not understood by the community, by the local community. So they are the one actually to provide it translators from English or Arabic to the local language. That's what we do. And even also production of this material, for example, whether written, posters, and so on. So that one also, we always look for a translator, verbal translation that will happen there. I don't know whether I answered both of them correctly. Over.
Thank you so much, Rin. Yes, I think if participants, if you have any following follow-up questions, please feel free to post in the Q&A or in the chat as well. Before giving the floor to the room, if I can pick up the latest, the one just popped in, the question just popped in. How can humanitarian organizations help children whose families suffer from climate change to be stable? And building on what Elena mentioned and emphasized on the working across sector or the needs to work with other sectors, either Elena, Lucy, Mona, either of you, if you're happy to answer this question, please come in.
I'll just jump in here to also add on what Lucy said about anticipatory action and how it relates back to climate change. I think there is a slight disconnect in timing, and Manami, you flagged this really consistently, but sometimes we only act when we can see the crisis coming. There's a big tornado coming, there's a big flood coming. El Nino season is here. But I think sometimes we need to think a bit more creatively about how we start to capture violence against children. Maybe it's rises in cholera cases. Maybe it's rises in kind of vaccine preventable diseases. Maybe it's kind of thinking about dropouts, children dropping out of school. So I think that if we unlock that extra layer of capturing different types of data about children specifically, we can start to address climate change, not climate shocks. So I think that jump has to be informed by practitioners, people like Ring, who are at the community levels, who are starting to see these things connect in a very real way. But we need to do a better job at spotlighting what works and to try to scale it up.
Thank you, Mona. Lucy, Elena, if you want to add anything from your end.
From my end, I think humanitarian organizations are doing a lot already, like for the protection of children around the globe in all contexts. What we're trying to emphasize here, I think, is that there is a need to strengthen, to work like with humanitarian organizations to strengthen our capacity to act like in this type of context that are shocks, as like Mona called them. But we can start to foresee this and be able to act upon them in a bit more of a prepared way. So that would be my contribution. Manami, over to you.
Thank you, Elena. And I want to give a chance to the people in the room, but also want to emphasize that, like Lucy mentioned about the prevention strategy, that we need to work together, like not child protection actors can fulfill our goal without working with other sectors. Like prevention, in the prevention strategy, many risk factors are associated with education, livelihood, or could be watch health. So before things happened, there are many ways to address or mitigate the risks. So to the room, I'm not sure how can hear you, but are there any questions in the room? Tech team, would be grateful if you could help us. And we can't visually see who is raising hand. So yes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. So it's related to the analysis on the correlation between heat waves, droughts, and increase in sexual and violence and abuse against girls. So what I wanted to know was, because there was no data on boys, did you see no incidence of the increase in sexual violence and abuse against boys, or were they actually kept out of your sample? We know girls are at higher risk, but boys, particularly young boys, are at risk as well, and there's very little data on that. So I just wanted to understand the rationale behind the results you presented in those two particular slides. Thank you.
It's a great question. Next time we'll do the 32 slides with everything in it. What we're seeing so far, and I've got to say, we've got to be cautious because these are early days of analyses, and it took us 18 months to work out how to overlay satellite data with violence against children survey data, and then how to merge the data across the country. So we spent most of our time trying to work out how to do this. But what we're seeing so far is that on emotional violence and physical violence, we're seeing almost equal impacts for boys and girls of drought and of extreme heat. But when it comes to sexual violence and transactional sexual exploitation, we are not seeing an impact for boys, and that's why I didn't show it. But I should have actually written that on the slide to say there was no significant effect for boys. But for girls, we're seeing these huge increases. Now, the violence against children surveys don't have as much data on boys. They've got about 22,000 across these 5 countries, 22,000 girls and about 6,000 boys. But it's still enough that we should be seeing these trends if it's happening. I don't think we just fully understand this yet. We're trying to also understand about younger and older children. Key next steps is going to be looking at, for example, children with disabilities and understanding, are they we would expect, but we don't know, are they at differential risk in climate change? We are early days with understanding this on a kind of aggregate quantitative level. But one thing that we have really been trying to understand is that, you know, when you read the learning needs analysis, and I was lucky to read several versions of it as it came through, you think, well, isn't this obvious? We know this from practitioners, and we also know it from practice experience. But when we move into the climate world is a world of large scale data. And you know, if we're thinking about, for example, COPs and IPCC, we're going to need to come at this with both types of knowledge, the practice knowledge and also most scientific knowledge. But it's slow getting there. It'd be interesting to hear, do you think there's any other types of violence that you think might be gendered that we should be looking at differently?
So Lucy, was that a question to Mona or to
I was just thinking, because you're
audience?
raising these questions and they're really important ones and we don't yet know.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for posing questions to the audience, because Elena has just put the link to the community of practice and a dedicated discussion stream on climate change, climate crisis and child protection. So I'm looking at the time, and our time is up now, but we would like to continue this discussion. And before closing, because Camila, if you're still with us, because there was a key question in the Q&A asking about how we can improve integrated child protection and climate change or adaptation. And not only that, but in the current context, in the current funding crisis, Camila, if you could mention about the advocacy resource pack, that probably could speak to the audience. Yeah.
Sure, that's fine. It would be great if someone can pop it on the chat while I'm talking. But just to say that we have just recently shared I think yesterday, our resource pack. Is primarily targeting child protection practitioners and advocates to be well equipped on the changes that we're seeing at the moment in the humanitarian sector in terms of funding, in terms of conversations about humanitarian architecture and a reset of that, so that people are well equipped to speak to the importance of child protection. And some of these things we've been needing to do for some time, as we've just been talking about, but it's just obviously put a bit of fire behind our efforts. So yeah, you can have a look at the resource pack. It will be regularly updated as information comes in, but it also includes a link to our bank of advocacy messages, which are generic, but there's also a set of messages at the end that are really more tailored for this sort of current sense of urgency around articulating what is life-saving for child protection, so the sort of sharp end of what we need to do. So hopefully that will be useful. We do also have a survey that's open for the next 3 weeks, where we're trying to understand the impact of the current funding situation on child protection services. So I think really this is where we can situate some of our work moving forward and use it in favour of our work on the climate crisis as well as more broadly. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions and the important and really your critical questions. So before you go, please let us know how you liked this session. Please go to the Menti link from the chat, QR code, or put in 8 digits. And we're looking forward to have another discussion with you all. Thank you so much. And thank you all the lovely speakers here today. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.